Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The Arrival at St. Mary's Hollow. The train rattled through the damp English countryside, its wheels humming a steady rhythm against the rails. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the autumn landscape. The rolling hills, dappled with fading greens and golds, were shrouded in a fine mist, and the air carried the promise of rain. She adjusted her shawl, her sharp eyes catching the fleeting shapes of hedgerows and distant church spires. St. Mary's Hollow, her destination, was a village she had not visited in years, though her old friend Lady Beatrix Hafford's letters had painted it vividly enough. "Such a quaint place, Jane," Beatrice had written, but not without its little dramas. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In her experience, quaint villages were rarely as innocent as they appeared. The train slowed, and the platform of St. Mary's Hollow came into view. A small tidy station with a single bench and a cluster of ivy clinging to the ticket office. Miss Marple gathered her modest suitcase and stepped onto the platform where a brisk wind tugged at her hat. A young man in a tweed cap, clearly the station porter, hurried to assist her. "Miss Marple, is it?" he asked, his voice bright but his eyes darting nervously. "Lady Hafford sent me to fetch you." "I'm Tom Bryce, thank you, Tom," she replied, her tone warm but probing. "You seem a bit out of sorts. Is all well in the village?" Tom hesitated, hoisting her suitcase into a waiting pony cart. "Oh, it's just the weather, miss. Puts folks on edge. And, well," he lowered his voice, "there's talk about that artist up at Morningside Cottage. Victor Langley keeps to himself, but people say he's odd." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Odd? In what way?" Tom shrugged, climbing into the driver's seat. "Don't know, miss. Just stories. Paints all hours, they say, and don't like visitors. Some reckon he's hiding something up there." The cart trundled along a winding lane, past stone walls and thatched cottages. St. Mary's Hollow unfolded before her, a picture postcard village with a green bordered by a pub, a post office, and a church with a lopsided steeple. Yet there was a stillness, a tension in the air, as if the village held its breath. Miss Marple noted the curtains twitching in windows, the quick glances of passers-by. Hereford Hall, Lady Beatrix's home, stood at the edge of the village, a Georgian manor with ivy-clad walls and a gravel drive. Beatrice herself, a spritly woman in her 60s with a penchant for lavender silk, greeted Miss Marple at the door. "Jane, my dear," Beatrice exclaimed, clasping her hands, "you haven't changed a bit. Come, you must be chilled to the bone. Tea is waiting." The drawing-room was warm with a crackling fire and a silver tea service gleaming on a mahogany table. As they settled with their cups, Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with gossip. "You'll find St. Mary's Hollow charming, Jane, but it's not without its peculiarities. That Victor Langley, for instance, lives in Morningside Cottage up on the hill. A recluse and not a friendly one. The villagers are quite divided about him." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression placid, but her mind alert. "Divided? How so?" "Some think he's a genius, others a menace," Beatrice said. "Mrs. Grayson, she's the matriarch of the Grayson family. Old Money says he's a disgrace painting those modern pictures, but young Clarabelle, the schoolteacher, swears he's misunderstood. Then there's Dr. Harrove, who treated him once and won't speak of it. Oh, and the vicar, Mr. Peaton, claims Victor's godless ways are a bad influence." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "A man who inspires such strong opinions must be interesting. Has anyone seen his paintings?" "Hardly," Beatrice replied. "He keeps his studio locked, though Clara Ara says she saw one once. A portrait, she thought, but it gave her the shivers." The conversation drifted to village life, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Morningside Cottage. She had met men like Victor Langley before, reclusive, secretive, perhaps burdened by a past they wished to forget. In her experience, such men often attracted trouble or, worse, invited it. As evening fell, the fire dimmed, and rain began to patter against the windows. Beatrice excused herself to speak with the housekeeper, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. She gazed out at the darkening hill, where Morningside Cottage stood silhouetted against the stormy sky. A light flickered in one window, brief and unsteady like a candle caught in a draught. "Odd indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. "And in my experience, oddity so often leads to something rather sinister. Before we move on, Detective, Where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. The Cottage on the Hill. The rain had settled into a steady drizzle by the following evening, casting a soft veil over St. Mary's Hollow. Miss Jane Marple, dressed in a sensible navy frog and her favourite brooch, sat in the dining room of Hafford Hall, where Lady Beatrice Hafford had arranged a small dinner to welcome her friend. The long oak table gleamed under the chandelier, its light catching the polished silver and crystal. Yet despite the warmth of the room, an undercurrent of unease rippled through the gathered guests, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed none of it. Beatrice had invited a select group from the village, each a figure of interest in the tapestry of St. Mary's Hollow. To Miss Marple's right sat Mrs. Eleanor Grayson, a formidable woman in her 50s, her pearl necklace and stiff posture proclaiming her status as the head of the Grayson family. Across from her was Clara Bell, the young schoolteacher, whose bright eyes and nervous smile suggested a mind both curious and cautious. Dr. Harold Haag Grove, the village physician, sat beside Clara Ara, his hands fidgeting with his napkin as he avoided direct eye contact. At the far end, the vicar, Mr. Arthur Peaton, a thin man with a perpetually worried expression, murmured grace before the meal. Beatrice, ever the gracious hostesses, steered the conversation with ease. "Jane, you must hear about our little village's quirks," she said, passing a dish of roast pheasant. "Morningside Cottage, for instance. It's the talk of St. Mary's Hollow, thanks to Mr. Langley." Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened. "A disgrace, that man," she said, her voice sharp as cut glass. "Living like a hermit, painting those monstrosities. The Graysons have owned land here for generations, and I won't have our village tarnished by such a character." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression mild. "You've seen his paintings, Mrs. Grayson?" "Not personally," Mrs. Grayson admitted, her cheeks flushing faintly, "but my son Robert says they're scandalous. He saw one at the cottage, a ghastly thing, all shadows and eyes. Victor Langley has no respect for tradition." Clara Bell set down her fork, her voice soft but firm. "I think you're too hard on him, Mrs. Grayson. Mr. Langley's work is unusual, yes, but it's powerful. I saw a sketch once when I delivered books to the cottage. It was a portrait, I think, of a woman. It wasn't scandalous, just sad." Dr. Harrove interjected, his tone abrupt. He cleared his throat as if regretting his outburst. "I mean to say, art is subjective, isn't it? No need to make a fuss." His fingers twisted the stem of his wine glass, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his hand. The vicar, Mr. Peaton, leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "I fear Mr. Langley's isolation is a spiritual concern. He's refused my visits, you know, a man who shuts out the world so completely." "Well, it suggests a troubled soul." Miss Marple sipped her wine, her eyes moving from face to face. "It's curious, isn't it, how a man who keeps to himself can stir such strong feelings. I wonder what he's hiding, or perhaps what he's hiding from." The table fell silent for a moment. The only sound, the patter of rain against the windows. Beatrice, sensing the tension, laughed lightly. "Oh, Jane, you'll have us all suspecting each other next. Let's speak of pleasant things. Clarice Ara, tell us about the children's pageant." Clara Ara brightened, launching into a tale of her pupils' antics. But Miss Marple's attention lingered on the others. Mrs. Grayson's rigid posture, Dr. Harrove's uneasy glances, Mr. Peaton's furrowed brow each betrayed a private disc. And then there was the absent Arbert Grayson, whom Beatrice had mentioned was delayed by business in London. A young man with strong opinions about Victor Langley, it seemed. As the meal ended and the guests moved to the drawing-room for coffee, Miss Marple excused herself to the veranda, claiming a need for fresh air. The night was cool, the rain a soft murmur, and in the distance Morningside Cottage loomed on its hill, a single light burning in its window. She recalled Tom Bryce's words at the station. "People say he's hiding something up there." Beatrice joined her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You're awfully quiet, Jane. Already puzzling over our village mysteries." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes still on the cottage. "Oh, just thinking, Beatrice. In my experience, a man who inspires such talk, genius or menace, loved or loathed, rarely lives a quiet life for long." As they returned to the drawing-room, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. Something about Morningside Cottage, and the man within it felt like the first thread of a much larger tangle, one she was determined to unravel. Chapter 3: A Scream in the Night. The rain had thickened by the third night of Miss Marple's stay in St. Mary's Hollow, drumming a relentless tattoo on the roof of Hafford Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, a small fire casting flickering shadows across the wallpaper. Her knitting lay idle in her lap as she listened to the storm, her thoughts circling back to the dinner at Hafford Hall and the undercurrents she had sensed among the guests. Mrs. Grayson's disdain, Dr. Harrove's unease, Clara Arabelle's defense of Victor Langley, all pieces of a puzzle that had yet to take shape. A sudden piercing scream shattered the quiet, slicing through the patter of rain. Miss Marple's head snapped up, her needles slipping to the floor. The sound had come from outside, sharp and fleeting, swallowed by the wind. She rose, pulling her shawl about her shoulders, and moved to the window. The hill where Morningside Cottage stood was cloaked in darkness, save for a faint glow in one window, now extinguished. Moments later, footsteps echoed in the hall and Lady Beatrice appeared at the door, her face pale beneath her lace cap. "Jane, did you hear that? A dreadful noise. Surely it came from the village. Or perhaps the hill," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes narrowing. "We'd best find out, Beatrice. Fetch your coat." By the time they reached the village green, a small crowd had gathered despite the rain. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness, casting eerie pools of light on wet cobblestones. Tom Bryce, the porter, stood at the edge, his face ashen. "It's Morningside Cottage, Mum," he said, spotting Miss Marple. Clara Arabelle heard it. "The scream," she says while passing by on her way home. She ran to fetch Constable Reed. Clarabelle stood nearby, her coat soaked, her eyes wide with fright. "I didn't see anything," she stammered. "Just heard it horrible, like someone in pain. I knocked, but no one answered." The door was locked. Constable Reed, a sturdy man with a walrus mustache, arrived with Dr. Harrove in tow. "Right then," Reed said gruffly. "We'll have a look. Dr. Hargrove, you'd best come along in case someone's hurt." Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, followed the group up the muddy path to Morningside Cottage. The small stone house loomed against the stormy sky, its windows dark and uninviting. The front door, heavy oak, was indeed locked, but a side window had been left ajar, its latch dangling loosely. Constable Reed pushed it open and climbed through, followed by Dr. Harrove and Tom, who carried a lantern. Inside, the cottage smelled of turpentine and damp wood. The parlour was sparsely furnished with a single armchair and a cluttered table holding paintbrushes and jars. A narrow staircase led to the upper floor where the studio lay. Miss Marple lingered in the parlour, noting a chipped teacup on the table, its saucer missing and a faint acrid sense she couldn't quite place. Up here, Constable Reed's voice boomed from above. The group hurried upstairs, Miss Marple moving with surprising agility for her age. In the studio, a chaotic space filled with canvases and easels, they found Victor Langley. He lay slumped in a chair by an unfinished painting, his head tilted back, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A paintbrush was clutched in his rigid hand, and a small glass vial lay shattered on the floor beside him. The air carried a bitter almond-like tang that made Dr. Harrove's face tighten. "Poison," the doctor said grimly, kneeling beside the body. "Cyanide, I'd wager, from the smell. He's been dead an hour, perhaps two." Constable Reed scratched his head. The door was locked. The window barely open. No signs of a struggle. How's poison get into a locked room? Miss Marple's eyes roamed the studio. The canvas on the easel depicted a stormy sea, its waves rendered in violent strokes of blue and grey. A sketchbook lay open on a nearby table, but one page had been torn out, leaving a jagged edge. She bent closer, her fingers brushing the table's surface, which felt faintly sticky. "Curious," she murmured almost to herself. "A man alone, yet not alone enough to escape death." Clara Arabelle, standing in the doorway, stifled a sob. He was so private. Who would do this? "That said, Miss Marple," her voice gentle but firm, "is precisely what we must discover." As Constable Reed sent for the coroner and the rain continued to fall, Miss Marple stepped back, her mind already sifting through the fragments of the scene. The locked door, the broken vial, the missing sketch, and that faint lingering smell. St. Mary's Hollow, it seemed, had a secret it was no longer willing to keep. Chapter 4: The Locked Room Puzzle. The morning after Victor Langley's death dawned grey and sodden, the rain a persistent murmur against the windows of Hafford Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat in the breakfast room, her tea cooling as she listened to Lady Beatrice recount the village's reaction to the tragedy. The news of the artist's demise had spread like wildfire, and St. Mary's Hollow buzzed with speculation. Yet Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on Morningside Cottage, where a locked door and a shattered vial posed questions that demanded answers. Constable Reed had permitted Miss Marple to accompany him and Dr. Harrove back to the cottage, ostensibly to offer a woman's perspective on the scene. In truth, Reed seemed out of his depth, and Miss Marple's reputation for noticing what others missed had reached even this quiet corner of England. As they trudged up the hill, the mud clinging to their boots, Miss Marple noted the cottage's isolation, far enough from the village to discourage casual visitors, yet close enough to be watched. Inside the studio, the air still held the faint, bitter tang of cyanide. Victor Langley's body had been removed, but the chair where he had sat remained, its worn upholstery dusted with paint flecks. The canvas on the easel, with its turbulent sea, seemed to watch over the room like a silent witness. Miss Marple's eyes moved methodically, taking in every detail. The chipped teacup from the parlor below, now joined by its saucer on a shelf, the sketchbook with its missing page, and a small overturned stool near the window, its legs scuffed as if kicked aside. Constable Reed scratched his mustache, frowning at the locked door. "It's a right puzzle, Miss Marple." Door bolted from the inside. Window too small for a man to climb through without a racket. Yet there's that vial cyanide. Dr. Harrove says, how'd it get here? Dr. Harrove, standing by the easel, shifted uncomfortably. "I've seen cyanide used in medical practice, but it's rare. Could have been in his paints. Some artists use it for pigments, though it's dangerous." But that smell he trailed off, his fingers drumming on his medical bag. Miss Marple knelt by the shattered vial, her handkerchief pressed to her nose. The glass fragments glittered on the floor, and a faint stain marked the wood beneath. "Curious," she said softly. "The vial is broken, yet the liquid seems to have spilled in a very particular way, almost as if it was dropped deliberately." Reed blinked at her deliberately. "You mean someone staged it?" Miss Marple said, her tone mild that we must consider all possibilities. "A locked room is not always as secure as it seems." She straightened, her gaze settling on the window. The latch, though loose, was rusted, suggesting it hadn't been opened in years. Yet the sill was free of dust, as if recently disturbed. She turned to Dr. Harrove. "You treated Mr. Langley once, I believe. Did he ever mention anything unusual about his health, perhaps? Or his habits?" Harrove's face tightened, and he busied himself with his bag. "Only the once for a minor ailment. He was a private man. Didn't say much. Complained of headaches, that's all." His eyes flicked to the sketchbook, then away, and Miss Marple noted the gesture. Stepping to the sketchbook, she flipped through its pages. The drawings were bold, almost unsettling, landscapes of jagged cliffs, faces half hidden in shadow. The torn edge where a page was missing caught her attention. "I wonder," she murmured, "what was so important about this sketch that it had to be removed?" Constable Reed sighed. Could have been Langley himself tidying up. Artists are odd folk. Perhaps Miss Marple said, her smile faint. But in my experience, things removed are often removed for a reason. As they left the cottage, Miss Marple lingered on the path, her eyes tracing the muddy ground. A faint track, barely visible in the rain-soaked earth, led from the window to a clump of bushes. She made no comment, but her mind catalogued the detail along with the acrid smell, the scuffed stool, and Dr. Harrove's unease. St. Mary's Hollow, she thought, was a village of secrets, and Morningside Cottage held more than most. Back at Hafford Hall, Beatrice greeted them with a fresh pot of tea. "Well, Jane, any theories? The village is in a tizzy. Mrs. Grayson swears it's suicide, but Clarabelle says Victor was too stubborn to take his own life." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "Suicide or murder, Beatrice. The truth lies in the details, and I suspect Morningside Cottage has a few more to share before we're done." Chapter 5, Whispers of the Past. The rain had eased to a fine mist by midday, cloaking St. Mary's Hollow in a silvery haze. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tucked under her arm, made her way to the village post office, a cramped shop that doubled as the epicenter of local gossip. The murder at Morningside Cottage had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple knew that in a village like this, the truth often hid in the whispers exchanged over counters and garden fences. Mrs. Tilly, the postmistress, was a stout woman with a penchant for dramatic pauses. As Miss Marple purchased a few stamps, she steered the conversation toward Victor Langley. "A terrible business, Mrs. Tilly," she said, her tone gentle. "Did you know Mr. Langley well?" Mrs. Till's eyes gleamed with the thrill of being consulted. "Well, miss, not well, but I saw enough. He'd come in for his letters, never many, mind you, and always in a hurry. Kept his coat collar up like he didn't want to be seen. Queer sort, if you ask me." "Queer in what way?" Miss Marple asked, adjusting her gloves. Mrs. Tilly leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Came to the village 5 years ago out of nowhere. Said he was from London, but I heard from Mrs. Baxter, she's the butcher's wife, that he'd been abroad, maybe Paris, running from something, she reckoned. A woman, most like." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A woman? How intriguing." Did Mrs. Baxter say more? "Oh, just title," Mrs. Tilly said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Something about a broken engagement years back. A lady of quality, they say, who broke his heart, made him bitter. If you ask me, he never mixed with folk here, save for Clarabelle, who'd bring him books. And the Graysons, well, they despised him." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the details. "The Graysons, you say?" "I met Mrs. Grayson at dinner. She seemed strong in her opinions." Mrs. Tilly snorted. "Helena Grayson thinks she owns St. Mary's Hollow. Her son Robert was worse about Langley, called him a fraud once right here in the shop, said those paintings were an insult to decent folk. Mind you, Robert's been in London these past days, so he's not heard the news yet." As Miss Marple left the post office, her mind turned over the fragments of gossip. Her broken engagement, a mysterious past, and the Graysons' enmity. It was a tangle, but one with threads she could pull. She decided to visit Clarabelle, who had seemed both sympathetic to Victor and shaken by his death. Clarabelle lived in a tidy cottage near the schoolhouse, its garden bright with late-blooming airs despite the gloom. She welcomed Miss Marple with a nervous smile, offering tea in a parlour cluttered with books and watercolour sketches. "I still can't believe it," Clarabelle said, pouring from a chipped teapot. Victor was so alive. His work was everything to him. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the tremor in Clarabelle's hands. "You admired his art, didn't you? You mentioned a portrait that struck you. Can you tell me more?" Clarabelle hesitated, her eyes flickering to a sketch on the wall. A delicate rendering of the village green. It was a woman's face, half-finished-ish. Her eyes were so sad, almost haunting. Victor wouldn't talk about it, but I felt, I don't know, like it meant something to him. He got cross when I asked, so I didn't press. "Curious," Miss Marple said softly. "And did he ever speak of his past? A woman, perhaps, or a reason he came to St. Mary's Hollow?" Clarabelle shook her head. "He was private, but once when I brought him a book on French artists, he said something odd. 'Paris breaks more than it builds,' he said, and his face went dark. I didn't dare ask more." As Miss Marple left Clarabelle's cottage, the mist had thickened, curling around the hedge like ghostly fingers. She paused by the churchyard where Mr. Peaton, the vicar, was tending a rosebush. His face, usually pale, was flushed with agitation. "Good day, Mr. Peaton," Miss Marple called. "A sad time for the village, is it not?" He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Very sad, Miss Marple. I tried to reach Mr. Langley to offer guidance, but he was unreceptive. A man adrift, I fear, and now this tragedy." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Adrift, you say? Did he ever hint at what troubled him?" Peyton frowned. Once, after a service, he lingered outside, muttered something about sins catching up. I thought it odd, but he walked off before I could ask more. As Miss Marple made her way back to Hafford Hall, the whispers of the village were together in her mind. A lost love in Paris, a feud with the Graysons, a haunting portrait, and sins that lingered. Victor Langley's past was a shadow over St. Mary's Hollow, and Miss Marple suspected it held the key to his death. The rain began to fall again, soft and insistent, as if urging her to unravel the truth before the storm broke anew. Chapter 6. The Artist's Secret. The rain had paused, leaving St. Mary's Hollow draped in a damp, silvery stillness. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella at the ready, walked the path to Morningside Cottage once more, having persuaded Constable Reed to allow her another look at the studio. "Just to clarify a few details," she had said, her mild tone masking the sharp curiosity that drove her. The constable, harried by paperwork and village gossip, had agreed, provided she touched nothing. Inside the cottage, The air was heavy with the lingering scents of turpentine and cyanide. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stairs to the studio, her steps deliberate, her eyes scanning for what others might have overlooked. The room was much as she had last seen it, the stormy canvas on the easel, the scuffed stool, the sketchbook with its torn page. But today her attention was drawn to a wooden chest tucked beneath a cluttered table, its lock scratched as if recently forced. Kneeling with care, Miss Marple opened the chest, revealing a stack of sketches bound in twine. The drawings were striking, angular faces, twisted landscapes, and one recurring image, a woman with mournful eyes, her features rendered with both precision and pain. The same face Clarabelle had described, Miss Marple noted, and strikingly similar to a photograph she glimpsed in Clara Ara's parlour, though she couldn't yet place why. One sketch, tucked at the bottom, was different, a caricature of a grand house, unmistakably Grayson Manor, with a shadowy figure lurking at its gates. The figure's face was scratched out. The pencil marks violent. "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the paper's edge. "What secrets you kept, Mr. Langley." She replaced the sketches, memorizing their details, and made her way to the village pub, the Rusty Anchor, where the evening crowd gathered to dissect the murder. The pub was a low ceiling room, its air thick with pipe smoke and the tang of ale. Miss Marple settled in a corner, her knitting in hand appearing as inconspicuous as a sparrow. Yet her ears caught every word. At the bar, Tom Bryce, the porter, was deep in conversation with Robert Grayson, who had returned from London that morning. Robert, a tall man in his 30s with sharp features and a restless energy, slammed his tankard down. Langley was a blight on this village, he declared, his voice carrying, painting his nonsense, stirring up trouble. "Good riddance, I say." Tom glanced around nervously. "Careful, Mr. Grayson. Folk'll think you had a hand in it." Rowett's laugh was harsh. "Me? I was in London when he died. Ask anyone. Besides, why bother with a man already ruining himself?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, but her eyes flicked to Robert's hands, clenched with a faint smudge of ink on one finger. Curious, she thought, for a man who claimed to despise art. Across the room, Clarabelle sat with Dr. Harrove, her face pale. The doctor's voice was low. "Urgent, Clara, you mustn't speak of his sketches. It'll only cause trouble." "But they meant something," Clara insisted, her voice trembling. "That woman in them, she was real, wasn't she?" Dr. Harrove's reply was cut off by the pub door swinging open, admitting Mrs. Grayson, her face a mask of disapproval. "Robert, you're making a spectacle," she snapped, striding to her son. "Can't you, Miss Bell, ought to mind your tongue about that man's filthy drawings?" Clara flushed but held her ground. "They weren't filthy. They were personal. Maybe if you'd known him enough." Mrs. Grayson's voice was ice. "The Grayson have no interest in that man's sordid past." She seized Robert's arm, steering him toward the door, but not before Miss Marple caught the flicker of fear in her eyes. As the pub settled, Miss Marple approached Clara, her smile gentle. "My dear, those sketches. Did you ever see one of a house?" "Perhaps Grayson Manor." Clara hesitated, then nodded. Once it was unsettling, like he was mocking them, but there was something angry about it. I didn't understand why. Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've been most helpful, Clara. Sometimes anger on paper speaks louder than words." As she left the pub, the mist had returned, curling around the lampposts. The sketches, the confrontation, Rurt's ink-stained fingers, it all pointed to a scandal buried deep, one that tied Victor Langley to the Graysons in ways yet unclear. Miss Marple glanced toward Grayson Manor, its lights faint in the distance. "A house with secrets," she murmured, "and a family determined to keep them." Chapter 7. The Shadow of Envy. The village fete held annually in St. Mary's Hollow proceeded despite the drizzle, as if the community sought to defy the shadow cast by Victor Langley's death. The green was alive with stalls selling jams, knitted scarves, and hot cider, while children darted through the crowd, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the grey sky. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in a woolen coat and her sensible hat, strolled among the revellers, her eyes sharp behind her mild smile. A village fete, she knew, was as much a stage for secrets as for merriment. Lady Beatrice Hafford had insisted Miss Marple join her at the fete, and they paused by a stall where Clarabelle was selling her pupils' drawings. Clara face was drawn, her usual brightness dimmed. "It feels wrong, doesn't it?" she said to Miss Marple, gesturing at the festive scene. "Victor's gone, and here we are, pretending all's well." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Grief takes its own time, my dear, but people do talk at such events, and talk can be illuminating." As if on cue, Robert Grayson appeared, his tailored coat damp from the mist. He was deep in conversation with Tom Bryce, the porter, whose nervous glances suggested discomfort. Miss Marple edged closer, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. "You're sure you saw me at the station?" Rhett was saying, his voice low but insistent. "That night, Tom, it's important." Tom shifted, his cap twisted in his hands. I think so, Mr. Grayson. It was late and the rain was heavy. I saw someone board the London train, but what?" Robert snapped, his face darkening. "It was dark, sir. Could have been anyone in a coat like yours." Tom's voice faltered, and he hurried off to help a customer, leaving Rhett scowling. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her mind, though her hands were still. Robert's alibi for the night of the murder, his claim of being in London, was shakier than he'd let on. She filed the observation away, her attention shifting to Mrs. Grayson, who stood near the church tent, her expression as stern as ever. Beside her, Dr. Hargrove was speaking animatedly, his gestures sharp. Miss Marple caught the words reckless and reputation before their voices dropped. The fete was interrupted by a commotion at the post office stall, where Mrs. Tilley waved a letter aloft. "Found it in the sorting tray," she announced, her voice carrying. "Addressed to Mr. Langley, but it never reached him. Must have been delivered the day he well, you know." Constable Reed, present to keep order, took the letter, his moustache twitching. "I'll hold on to this, Mrs. Tilley. Could be evidence." But Miss Marple, standing nearby, glimpsed the envelope. No return address, the handwriting elegant but hurried, and a faint smudge of ink on the flap. "May I see it, Constable?" she asked, her tone deferential. Reed hesitated, then handed it over, muttering about civilian meddling. Miss Marple turned the envelope in her hands, noting its weight. "Unopened," she said softly. How curious that it arrived too late. Back at Hafford Hall that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire. The letter, now opened with Reed's permission, spread before her. It was brief, written in the same elegant hand. "Victor, you cannot hide forever. The truth will out, and I will see it done." Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. "Kaledlanina Grayson, or another yet unknown." The letter's tone suggested a confrontation, a threat even, but its vagueness was maddening. She thought of Robert's crumbling alibi, Clara Ara's haunted expression, and Dr. Harrove's agitation at the fete. Envy, she suspected, was at the heart of this tangle, an envy tied to Victor's art, his past, or perhaps something deeper. Beatrice entered, her face alight with gossip. "Jane, you'll never guess. Robert Grayson was seen arguing with Victor a week before the murder near the cottage. Tom Bryce overheard something about debts unpaid. And now this letter. Do you think it's connected?" Miss Marple folded the letter, her smile faint. "Everything is connected, Beatrice, if one looks closely enough, and I suspect this letter is but one thread in a very tangled web." As the rain resumed its soft patter against the windows, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the sketches in Victor's chest, the scratched-out figure at Grayson Manor, and the shadow of envy that seemed to linger over St. Mary's Hollow. The fate had revealed more than its organizers intended, and she felt the truth drawing closer, like a figure emerging from the mist. Chapter 8. Rain and Revelations. The storm that had threatened St. Mary's Hollow for days broke with fury that evening, thunder rolling across the hills, and rain lashing the windows of Hafford Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the tempest outside. Lady Beatrice, restless, paced by the fire, her earlier cheer dampened by the village's growing unease over Victor Langley's murder. "It's as if the weather itself is against us, Jane," she said, peering out at the deluge. "No one's talking of anything but that wretched cottage." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Storm, Beatrice, have a way of stirring things up, secrets included." Her words proved prophetic when Constable Reed arrived, his oilskin coat dripping onto the rug. "Beg pardon, Lady Hafford," he said, his moustache drooping with wet. "Miss Marple, I thought you'd want to know. We found something at Morningside Cottage. Thought you might. Well, take a look." Intrigued, Miss Marple donned her coat and followed Reed into the storm, her umbrella barely holding against the wind. The path to Morningside Cottage was a quagmire, but Miss Marple's steps were steady, her mind alert. At the cottage, Reed led her to the parlor where a lantern illuminated a fresh discovery, a muddy footprint partially smudged near the side window. It was small, almost delicate, and pressed into the floorboards as if someone had stepped inside from the rain-soaked night. "Found it this afternoon," Reed said, scratching his head. "Missed it before? What with all the to-do? Doesn't match Langley's boots, nor any man's, I'd wager. Too small." Miss Marple knelt, her handkerchief shielding her fingers as she traced the footprint's edge. "A woman's shoe, perhaps," she murmured. "Or a man with uncommonly small feet. And look, there's a trace of red clay, not the brown mud of the path. Curious, don't you think?" Reed frowned. "Clay, there's none round here. Not unless you go to the old quarry by Grayson Manor." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind catalogued the detail. She moved to the window, noting its loose latch and the absence of dust on the sill. "This window," she said. "Was it open when you first arrived, Constable?" "Cracked?" "Yes," Reed admitted. "But too narrow for anyone to climb through, I thought." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But a key might pass through a narrow gap." She pointed to a small brass hook on the wall, empty, but bearing the faint outline of a key's shape in the dust. "Was there a key here before?" Reed's eyes widened. "There was, now you mention it. The spare for the front door gone missing, though. Thought Langley misplaced it." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the hook. A stolen key, a footprint from foreign clay, and a window just ajar. The pieces were beginning to align, though the picture remained elusive. As they left the cottage, the storm raged on, lightning briefly illuminating the hill. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a glint in the bushes near the path, a sliver of metal half buried in the mud. She stooped, retrieving a small ornate key, its surface tarnished but intact. "Constable," she said, holding it up, "I believe we found what was lost." Back at Hereford Hall, warmed by the fire, Miss Marple examined the key under a lamp. Its design was intricate, unlike the cottage's simple locks suggesting it belonged elsewhere. Perhaps Grayson Manor, where red clay was plentiful. She recalled the cryptic letter signed E, Rurt's shaky alibi, and Clara Ara's mention of the unsettling sketch of the manor. The threads were weaving together, but the pattern was still unclear. Beatrice, hovering nearby, gasped at the key. "Jane, where did you find that? It looks like one of the Graysons. They've got all sorts of old keys for their estate." "Does it now?" Miss Marple said softly. "Then perhaps it's time we paid a visit to Grayson Manor. Secrets Beatrice have a way of hiding in plain sight, especially in a house as old as that." As the storm roared outside, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the footprint, the key, and the clay that didn't belong. The murder at Morningside Cottage was no longer just a puzzle. It was a story of betrayal, and she was determined to read its final chapter. Chapter 9. The Grayson Legacy. The rain had settled into a persistent drizzle, cloaking St. Mary's Hollow in a melancholy haze. Miss Jane Marple, her umbrella tilted against the wind, walked the gravel path to Grayson Manor, accompanied by Lady Beatrice Hafford, who had insisted on joining her. The manor loomed ahead, its stone Ascension Island stone facade stern and imposing, a relic of the Grayson family's centuries-old influence in the village. Miss Marple clutched the ornate key she had found near Morningside Cottage, its intricate design a silent question in her pocket. She suspected the Graysons held answers to Victor Langley's murder, and she intended to find them. Mrs. Elenina Grayson greeted them in the manor's drawing room, a cavernous space with heavy drapes and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. Her manner was polite but guarded, her pearl necklace gleaming as she offered tea. Rupert Grayson lounged by the fireplace, his sharp eyes tracking Miss Marles's every move. The air was thick with unspoken tension, as if the manor itself held its breath. "Thank you for receiving us, Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. "I've been so curious about your family's history here. Grayson Manor is quite the landmark, isn't it?" Mrs. Grayson's smile was tight. "5 generations, Miss Marple. We've shaped St. Mary's Hollow, kept its traditions alive. Not like that Langley fellow with his modern ideas." Her tone dripped with disdain, and Rurt's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. Miss Marple sipped her tea, noting the room's details. A locked cabinet in the corner, a faded tapestry depicting a hunt, and a photograph on the mantel. A younger Mrs. Grayson, with a woman whose face was hauntingly familiar. "Your family's influence is clear," she said. But I understand there was some friction with Mr. Langley. A disagreement, perhaps. Robert's voice was sharp. He was a troublemaker, mocked our name with those sketches of his. I saw one once, a caricature of this very house with some figure skulking about. Insulting, really. Mrs. Grayson's hand froze on her teacup. Robert, that's enough. Mr. Langley's death is tragic, but it's no concern of ours. He kept to himself, and so do we. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Of course, though I wonder about this, she produced the ornate key, holding it delicately. Found near Morningside Cottage. It seems to match the locks here, doesn't it? Mrs. Grayson's face palled, and Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. Where did you get that? He demanded. It's an old servant's key lost years ago. Means nothing. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly. But it's curious, isn't it? A key from your estate found near a murder scene. She paused, her gaze drifting to the photograph. And this lady, such a striking resemblance to a face in Mr. Langley's sketches, a relative, Mrs. Grayson. Mrs. Grayson's lips thinned. My late cousin Margaret. She left the village years ago, a private matter long forgotten. Her voice was clipped, but her fingers twisted her. Pearls betraying unease. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. How sad. Broken ties often leave traces, don't they? She rose, thanking them for their hospitality, but her mind was racing. The photograph of Margaret matched the mournful woman in Langley's sketches, and the key linked the manor to the cottage. She recalled the red clay of the footprint abundant near the manor's quarry, and the cryptic letter signed E. Elelanina, or another shadow from the Grayson past. As they left, Beatrice whispered, Jane, you've rattled them. Did you see Mrs. Grayson's face? I did, Miss Marple replied softly. The Grayson have a legacy, Beatrice, but not all of it is as proud as they claim. There's a story here of love, betrayal, perhaps revenge, and I mean to uncover it. The drizzle followed them back to Havford Hall, the manor's lights fading into the mist. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Margaret, the key and the scratched-out figure in Langley's sketch. The Grayson legacy was a tangled web, and she sensed its threads led straight to Morningside Cottage and Victor Langley's death. Chapter 10, A Dangerous Confession. The rain had returned with a vengeance, battering St. Mary's Hollow and turning the village lanes into rivers of mud. Miss Jane Marple sat in the cosy library of Havford Hall, her knitting needles clicking softly as she pondered the threads of Victor Langley's murder. The ornate key, the red clay footprint, the cryptic letter signed E, and the haunting sketches of a woman who resembled Margaret, Mrs. Grayson's late cousin. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture remained tantalizingly incomplete. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Lady Beatrice ushered in Clarabel, soaked and trembling, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple, Clara Ara said, her voice breaking. I need to speak with you. It's about Victor. Beatrice, sensing the gravity, excused herself, leaving Miss Marple and Clara Ara alone by the fire. Clara Ara clutched a handkerchief, her words tumbling out. I did it, Miss Marple. I killed Victor. I can't bear the guilt anymore. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, but her expression remained calm. My dear, that's a serious thing to say. Tell me exactly what happened. Clara Ara's story poured forth in a rush. She had visited Morningside Cottage the night of the murder, she said, to return a book. Victor had been agitated, ranting about debts and sins catching up. They argued. Clara Ara admitted she'd grown fond of him, but he'd rebuffed her, saying his heart belonged to another long gone. In a fit of anger, she claimed she'd slipped cyanide from his paint supplies into his tea, leaving him to die. Miss Marple listened, her needles pausing. The confession was heartfelt, but something rang false. Clara Ara, she said gently, cyanide is a swift poison, if you left him alive. How did the vial end up shattered on the floor? And why was the door locked from within? Clara Ara faltered, her eyes darting to the window. I don't know. I was upset. Maybe he locked it after I left. And the key, Miss Marple pressed, her voice soft but insistent. The one missing from the cottage found near the bushes. Clara's hands twisted her handkerchief. I didn't take any key. I swear it. Miss Marple leaned back, her mind working. Clara Ara's confession was too tidy, too convenient, and it failed to account for the red clay footprint or the torn sketch. She suspected Clara was protecting someone, or perhaps herself, from a truth she couldn't face. My dear, Miss Marple said, I think you're carrying a burden that isn't yours. Will you trust me to find the truth? Clara nodded, tears spilling, and left to compose herself. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, devised a subtle trap. She sent a note to Constable Reed, suggesting he let slip at the village pub that a witness had seen a woman near Morningside Cottage the night of the murder wearing a distinctive scarf. Miss Marple had no such witness, but she knew Clara often wore a blue scarf, and she wanted to see who might react. That evening, Beatrice hosted a small gathering at Hapford Hall, inviting the key players, Mrs. Grayson, Robert, Dr. Harrove, and Mr. Peaton. The air was thick with tension as Reed, prompted by Miss Marple, casually mentioned the witness and the scarf. Mrs. Grayson's teacup rattled in its saucer, and Dr. Harrove's face paled, his fingers gripping his glass. Robert, however, was the most telling. He stood abruptly, muttering about needing air, and left the room. Miss Marple followed discreetly, lingering in the hall as Robert spoke in hushed tones to his mother outside. "You said it was handled," he hissed. "If they're sniffing around about a scarf, we're in trouble." Mrs. Grayson's reply was sharp. "Keep your voice down, Robert. It's nothing. Stay calm." Miss Marple retreated, her heart quickening. The trap had worked, stirring unease, but it also confirmed her doubts about Clara's confession. The girl's story didn't fit the Graysons' agitation, or the physical clues, the key, the clay, the sketches. Someone else had been at the cottage, someone tied to the Grayson legacy and the woman in Victor's drawings. As the storm raged outside, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind weaving the threads together. "A confession," she murmured, "is only as true as the heart behind it. And I fear Clara's heart is hiding more than it tells." Chapter 11, The Final Clue. The rain had softened to a whisper, but the air in St. Mary's Hollow remained heavy with anticipation, as if the village itself sensed the unraveling of its secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room at Hapford Hall, her knitting set aside as she examined the ornate key, the cryptic letter signed E, and her notes on the case. The red clay footprint, the missing sketch, Clara's dubious confession, and the Graysons' unease all pointed to a truth buried in Victor Langley's past. Yet one piece was missing, and Miss Marple felt it was close at hand. That morning she returned to Morningside Cottage, with Constable Reed's reluctant permission, her eyes searching for what she had overlooked. The studio was as she remembered, the stormy canvas, the scuffed stool, the sketchbook with its torn page. But her attention was drawn to a small dusty frame half hidden behind a stack of canvases. She lifted it carefully, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman, her mournful eyes unmistakable, the same face as in Victor's sketches, and the same as Margaret, Mrs. Grayson's cousin, from the photograph at Grayson Manor. The photograph was worn, its edges creased as if handled often, and tucked behind it was a folded note yellowed with age. Miss Marple unfolded it, her heart quickening as she read, "My dearest Victor, I cannot stay. They will never allow it. Forgive me." The pieces snapped into place. Margaret, the Graysons, Victor's bitterness. It was a story of love thwarted and secrets kept. Miss Marple slipped the photograph and note into her pocket, her mind racing. The letter signed E, the key from Grayson Manor, the red clay, all pointed to a betrayal that had festered for years. She returned to Hapford Hall and asked Lady Beatrix to arrange a gathering that evening, inviting Mrs. Grayson, Robert, Clara Bell, Dr. Harrove, and Mr. Peaton. "It's time, Beatrice," she said, her voice calm but resolute, "to lay this matter to rest." The drawing room was lit by a roaring fire, its glow casting long shadows across the gathered faces. Mrs. Grayson sat rigid, her pearls gleaming. Rupert's eyes darted nervously. Clara clutched her scarf, her face pale. Dr. Harrove fidgeted with his cufflinks, and Mr. Peaton murmured a prayer under his breath. Constable Reed stood by the door, his moustache twitching with curiosity. Miss Marple stood, her small figure commanding the room. "Thank you for coming," she began, her tone gentle but firm. "Victor Langley's death has troubled us all, and I believe we can now uncover the truth. It begins as so many tragedies do, with a love that was not allowed to flourish." She produced the faded photograph, holding it up. "This is Margaret, Mrs. Grayson's cousin, who loved Victor Langley years ago in Paris. Their engagement was broken, not by choice but by pressure, perhaps from the Grayson family, who saw Victor as unworthy." Mrs. Grayson's face tightened, but she said nothing. Robert shifted, his hands clenched. Miss Marple continued. "Victor came to St. Mary's Hollow, perhaps to confront the past. His sketches filled with Margaret's face. But someone else knew of this history, someone who wrote this. She held up the letter signed E. Elanina. I presume Mrs. Grayson. Mrs. Grayson's voice was icy, preposterous. I wrote no such thing. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. But the key found near the cottage from your manor and the red clay footprint from your quarry suggest a connection. Anne Clarara's confession, well, it was brave but false, meant to protect someone dear to her. Clarara gasped, her eyes welling. I thought I was helping. Miss Marple's gaze softened, then sharpened as it turned to Dr. Harrove. Doctor, you treated Victor once, but you knew more than you let on. You recognized Margaret in his sketches, didn't you? Because you too were in Paris years ago when Margaret vanished. Harrove's face drained of color. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, Miss Marple said. And I think you know who E truly is. She paused, letting the silence weigh on the room, but we shall see. The truth, like a photograph, develops with time. As the fire crackled and the rain murmured outside, Miss Marple knew the final revelation was near. The photograph, the note, and the gathered suspects would soon unmask the killer and the scandal that had led to Morningside Cottage's tragedy. Chapter 12, The Unveiling of the Truth. The drawing room of Hafford Hall was hushed. The fire's crackle and the soft patter of rain outside, the only sounds breaking the tension. Miss Jane Marple stood at the center, her small figure radiating quiet authority as she faced the gathered suspects. Mrs. Elanina Grayson, rigid with defiance. Rupert Grayson, his sharp features taut. Clara Bell clutching her scarf with tearful eyes. Doctor. Harold Hargrove, pale and fidgeting, and Mr. Peaton, the vicar, his hands clasped in prayer. Constable Reed stood by the door, his notebook ready as Lady Beatrice watched with bated breath. Miss Marple held up the faded photograph of Margaret, its mournful eyes a silent accusation. Victor Langley's death, she began, her voice clear and steady, was not a random act, but the culmination of a betrayal that began years ago. This photograph found in his studio tells us of a love lost. Margaret, Mrs. Grayson's cousin, who loved Victor in Paris but was torn from him. Mrs. Grayson's lips tightened. That's old history, Miss Marple. It has no bearing on this. So, but it does, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. Victor came to St. Mary's Hollow, I believe, to confront that past. His sketches of Margaret, his caricature of Grayson Manor, they were not just art but accusations, and someone feared what he might reveal. She produced the letter signed E. This letter, addressed to Victor, warned that the truth will out. I suspected you, Mrs. Grayson, but the handwriting doesn't match, nor does it belong to anyone here, except one who has been overlooked. The room stirred, eyes darting. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Harrove. Doctor, you were in Paris when Margaret and Victor were together. You knew her, didn't you? And you loved her too. Harrove's face crumpled, his voice a whisper. Yes, I loved her, but she chose Victor. I left Paris, tried to forget. Miss Marple nodded. But you couldn't. When Victor arrived here painting Margaret's face, you feared he'd expose the truth, that Margaret didn't leave willingly. She died, didn't she? And the Graysons, to protect their name, covered it up. Robert stood, his voice shaking. That's a lie. My family, sit down, Robert, Miss Marple said firmly. Your mother's cousin was shamed, sent away, and her death was no accident. Victor knew, and his sketches were a threat. But you, Doctor, had another reason. Jealousy. You poisoned Victor's tea with cyanide from your medical supplies, didn't you? Harrove's hands trembled. No, I couldn't. Miss Marple held up the ornate key. This key from Grayson Manor was found near the cottage. You took it, Doctor, to enter and stage the scene, locking the door to suggest suicide. The red clay footprint from the Manor's quarry betrayed you. And the torn sketch, Margaret's face scratched out, was your attempt to erase the past. Clara gasped. But I confessed, I thought I'd done it. In a moment of anger, Miss Marple's gaze softened. You loved Victor, Clara, and blamed yourself for his rejection. But your confession didn't fit. The shattered vial, the locked door. You were protecting someone, perhaps unknowingly. The true killer was Dr. Harrove. Harrove broke his voice a sob. I saw her in his sketches every day, mocking me. He was going to tell everyone about Margaret, about the Graysons' lies. I couldn't let him ruin her memory. Mrs. Grayson's face was ashen. You fool, Harold. Margaret's death was an accident, a fall, nothing more. We sent her away to protect her, not to harm her. Miss Marple shook her head. Yet you hid it, Mrs. Grayson, and that secrecy drove Victor to his art and Dr. Hargrove to murder. The letter signed E was from Esther, a friend of Margaret's in Paris who suspected the truth and wrote to warn Victor. Constable Reed stepped forward, his voice gruff. Dr. Harrove, you'll come with me. As Harrove was led away, the room exhaled. Clara wept quietly, and Robert comforted his mother, whose pride had crumbled. Miss Marple folded the photograph, her heart heavy. Love and envy, she said softly, are powerful motives, but the truth, like rain, always finds a way to surface. The fire flickered, and the rain fell softly outside as St. Mary's Hollow began to heal from the secrets that had torn it apart. Chapter 13, Epilogue. The village settles. The rain had finally lifted, leaving St. Mary's Hollow bathed in a tentative autumn sunlight. Miss Jane Marple stood on the platform of the village station, her modest suitcase at her feet, her knitting bag slung over her arm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading leaves, and the village seemed to breathe easier now that the truth about Victor Langley's murder had been laid bare. Yet, as Miss Marple knew, no village emerged from such a scandal unchanged. Lady Beatrice Hafford stood beside her, her lavender silk scarf fluttering in the breeze. "Jane, you've worked a miracle," she said, her voice warm but tinged with melancholy. "Dr. Hargrove's arrest, the Graysons' confession about Margaret. It's shaken us, but perhaps we needed shaking." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Villages, like people, Beatrice, often hide their wounds. Exposing them can be painful, but it allows healing." She glanced toward the hill where Morningside Cottage stood empty, its windows dark. "Victor Langley came here seeking truth, and in his death he found it for others." Beatrice sighed. "Poor Clara Bell. She's taken it hard, blaming herself for not seeing Victor's pain, but she's stronger than she thinks. She's planning to exhibit his sketches, you know, to honor him." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Clara Ara's tearful relief when Dr. Harrove confessed, freeing her from her misguided guilt. The Graysons, too, had shifted. Mrs. Grayson's rigid pride had softened, and Herbert had spoken of restoring the Manor's quarry to aid the village, perhaps to atone for their family's silence about Margaret's death. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, and Miss Marple adjusted her hat. She thought of the faded photograph, the ornate key, the red clay footprint, and the letter signed E, all threads in a tapestry of love, envy and betrayal. Dr. Harrove's trial loomed, but his confession had lifted a weight from St. Mary's Hollow, revealing Margaret's tragic fall and the Graysons' cover-up. Esther, Margaret's friend from Paris, had been traced through the letter, her warning to Victor a final act of loyalty. As the train pulled into the station, Tom Bryce, the porter, hurried to load her suitcase. "You've done us a service, Miss Marple," he said, his earlier nervousness replaced by gratitude. "Folks are talking again. Proper, like, not whispering." Miss Marple smiled. "Talk is a village's lifeblood. Tom, keep it kind and you'll do well." She boarded the train, settling by the window a saint. Mary's Hollow receded into the golden haze. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, and she reflected on the case. A locked room, a broken vial, a love lost in Paris, and a doctor undone by jealousy. "People," she murmured, "are so very predictable, yet so very surprising." The train rattled on, carrying her back to St. Mary Me, where other puzzles no doubt awaited. Behind her, St. Mary's Hollow settled into its new rhythm.